Dave's Podcast, Episode 8. Flybent missiles, donkey jackets, trucking, and a day trip to the seaside. So I arrived at Aldermaston in the autumn of 1983. It was a different world back then. Russia was considered the big baddie and was threatening world peace in Europe. So actually, pretty much the same as today. I arrived at the main gate and was escorted onto a minibus with 6 other people. They were all on their first day. There was plumbers, drivers, electricians. We were driven to this lecture hall and we started having our induction day. This involved talks on the history of Britain's nuclear bomb, security procedures, and various health and safety. It was all rather dull and boring. Then we were told we were going to watch a film. All the lights went out. The story started. The main character was a mundane and rather plain civil servant. He was persuaded to go out one night and ended up in this club. Suddenly, he was surrounded by all these naked ladies. It was a very 1970s porn film vibe to it, but it certainly woke us all up. The premise of the film was the man was caught in this compromising position, and he was then blackmailed by foreign agents. For the next 4 years, I was wary about being set upon by naked women at any time, but it never happened. In the afternoon, we had our photo taken, and later then we were issued with our passes. These would have to be shown every time we came through the gate at Aldermaston. The next day, I went to the main gate, and I was picked up by a man called Roy. He was going to be my immediate boss. He took me down to this building. It was rather plain from the outside, and it had just a letter and a number on the outside, something like S5, but I can't really remember. The building was the size of a large B&Q. If you picture the storage facility in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, it was like that. Rows of racks, 4 high right up to the roof, wooden crates and strange shapes packed on pallets. Some of these items I never moved all the years I was there, and they hadn't been moved for years before that. Sometimes the scientists involved had retired or even died. They're probably still there to this day, 40 years later. There was also shelves and shelves of smaller items in boxes. There was also a small room 10 foot by 10 foot, which was kept locked. The key was obtained only from Roy. This contained classified items. The rest of the building had an office area with 4 desks. Next to this was a large packing area with a large table, various boxes and sticky tape. At the far end of the building was a shipping area which employed 2 chippies. I'm going to call them Ant and Dec. They spent most of the time talking form, horse racing and betting. There was a small office there with a lady called Val. She was in charge of shipping. We would ship hundreds of aluminium crates out to the Nevada desert in the USA. But she always said she was nothing to do with the nuclear bomb, and she was very anti-nuke. I thought this was a bit hypocritical. I knew we were only there because of the bomb. I was under no illusion. There was also a large bit of the building that had a blue door on it with radioactive signs on. Behind that was 45-gallon oil drums with various things stored in. We had to get special clearance to be able to put that on the vehicle to deliver them within sight. Later that day, I was sent across to the main stores. I had to pick up my clothing. I was issued with black safety boots with a white flash down the back. I think the idea was to stop people going home in these boots, but most people just coloured the black in with a permanent marker. I was given a donkey jacket with MOD on the back, socks and a white lab coat. I was then introduced to my vehicle. It was a 7.5-ton Bedford truck with a rear tail lift. It's the largest truck you can drive without an HGV licence. It was about 5 years old, but had only done a couple of thousand miles, as it was only used on site. I tell a lie, about 4 times a year I used to go somewhere off site. Some aluminium boxes would arrive in shipping, and I would deliver them to an unclassified country house about 3 miles up the road. These contained seismic tapes from various places around the world. These would be checked to see if a foreign power had set off a nuclear bomb. I had a short test from someone from the transport department. I drove round site, did a bit of reversing. He was happy and I was good to go. I only worked directly with about 4 or 5 people. There was Margaret, a 60-plus lady who chain smoked. I'm not entirely sure what she did, but she shuffled a lot of paper around. There was Ruth, a girl about my age, who was engaged to one of the Stacey boys. Stacey's Demolition was a large firm in Tadley. I became very good friends, and Debbie and I went to her wedding. She also recommended a car which I bought. It belonged to Mrs. Stacey, her soon-to-be mother-in-law. She lived in a large bungalow, but it was right next to Stacey's yard, so this car had only done 30,000 miles. It was a 1972 BMW 2002 automatic. It came to a very sad end, but I'll tell you about that later. Who else was there? Oh yes, there was Fred, my charge hand. He was a thin, wiry man who always had a rolled-up cigarette permanently clamped to his lips. He was a thoroughly unpleasant man who had a very strange moral compass. He was perfectly open with the fact that he went away every year on holiday with his mistress, leaving his wife at home. But he was always criticising me for living together before getting married. There was George, who worked in the scrapyard, but he came to help us from time to time. He was from Newcastle, but a Manchester United supporter, who was at the European Championship Cup final in 1968. He would tell me the story every few days. "Have I told you about the cup final, Dave?" No, George." I was always too polite to say yes. I mean, you wouldn't catch me endlessly repeating the same stories. George always wore a cowboy hat and rode a bike 7 miles from Bramley to work every day and every day back. He lived with his mum. Margaret always greeted him with "How's mum?" and George would give a 10-minute account of all her various ailments, which were exactly the same as the day before. George would cycle into Basingstoke every Saturday to do his shopping. As it was Saturday, he would be in full cowboy gear: hat, waistcoat, belt and cowboy boots. I liked George. I could talk football with him. Other people thought he was a bit weird, but he was harmless, and as you know, I have been partial to cowboy boots myself. I do apologise for the next piece of podcast if you can pick up a helicopter buzzing really low on the microphone. I don't know whether this is MI5 checking up on a security breach. Both Fred and George had worked at Aldermaston for many years, before health and safety became an issue. They were very cavalier in their attitude to radiation. "Come on, let's just get on with it." I mean, you can't see radiation or smell it. It's not like digging coal, where the dangers are seen every day. Sadly, a couple of years after I left Aldermaston, George had died of cancer. I was told this by Fred, who was buying some smoked haddock one day in Bramley. I'm jumping a few jobs here. Sadly, a few years after that, Fred had also died of cancer. I'm just saying. So my duties as a storeman at the Flybent stores was each morning orders would come down from the engineers and be printed out by a computer. The items were then collected and delivered to scientists on site. But a busy day would merely be about half a dozen orders. At first it was difficult to find the correct building, as every area just had letters and numbers. The letter referred to the area and the number was the number of the building. But as we had our regular drops, I soon got the hang of it. I had been there about 3 weeks when Roy called me into his office. "Dave, we have a problem. You're working too fast." He told me to pace myself. I was making everyone else look bad. I was shocked. I mean, at this point I had spent 6 years working mostly in jobs that needed everything done yesterday. A few days later, I was told the big boss was coming over, and Roy asked me to make myself scarce. He said, "Well, go for a drive and park up for half an hour." This was all new to me. The work ethics and timetable was all completely new to me. Let me run through a typical day. We would start work at 7:50, but this involved arriving, making a cup of tea, reading the paper, discussing last night's TV until about 8:20. We would work till around 9:50, then we would stop and prepare for 10 o'clock tea break. Tea break, more discussion, swapping newspapers, Fred and Margaret smoking. The tea breaks ran for 20 minutes and were supposed to finish at 10:20, but we normally finished around 10:30. Back to work till we would stop and prepare for lunch at around 12:15. Lunch was 12:30 to 1:30. Start work again around 20 to 2. Prepare for afternoon tea around 2:50. Tea break was 3 to 3:20, but we would finish around 3:30. Do a little bit more before stopping at 4:15 to prepare to finish for work at 4:30. You get the picture. We did overtime on Tuesday and Thursday night till 6:30, Saturday morning and all day Sunday. At the time, women weren't allowed to do Sunday overtime. It was considered they should be at home in the kitchen making Sunday lunch. But this changed in a few months. After I'd been there a few months, we had an item on an order to be delivered to an MAD establishment near the seaside in the southeast. This happened about 4 or 5 times a year. For security reasons, we refer to this as North Start. It certainly didn't have the longest pier in the world. These items were quite small, so there would be me and a driver in a Ford Escort, with a Land Rover containing 2 armed policemen following. We would leave at 6 o'clock in the morning. Only then would we be given our route, either the North Circular, the South Circular, up to Oxford, or down to the coast. This was early 1984. The M25 was a few years off yet. It would take us 3 or 4 hours to deliver the item. Once we delivered, the police escort was no longer required and left. There was a certain thing called an off-site payment, which came in if you'd been off-site for 12 hours. So the driver would hang about. I don't think it was a lot of money, I can't remember. We would go to the seaside, walk along the pier, as I say, not the longest in the world, eat fish and chips. It was okay if we had a nice driver, but sometimes you had a grumpy old git. The time would really drag. Often we would be parked up in a lay-by a few miles from Aldermaston, waiting for 6:30. But by then I just wanted to get home to Deb. We're into spring 1984, and at this time we were saving like mad to buy a house. The date of the wedding had been set to June the 30th. So I was doing a lot of overtime. This often involved working in different stores. Sometimes I would work in the metal store next door. This was full of really hairy, greasy blokes, but they were okay. I got on with them pretty well. One of them I'm going to call Rock. He looked like one of the twin cavemen driving the wheeled boulder, the Bouldermobile, in the Wacky Races cartoon. I would often call in the morning and say hello. He would use an oxyacetylene torch and maybe was cutting a 6 foot by 6 foot steel sheet about 12 inches thick. The system he ran on a guide and would slowly creep across, cutting through it. I would call in the next day and he still would have a third to go. He would sit there reading old paperbacks with black greasy hands, which rendered them useless after he touched them, so he would tear out the blackened pages and throw them away. I also worked in the gas stores. They mainly delivered liquid nitrogen from electric vehicles, as well as gas bottles. The charge hand there was very particular about his tea. He had a large tea urn which he brewed in, and he shouted at me once for daring to pour some tea out before the allotted time. Most of these blokes had worked in the same store for many years. They knew their job and they were happy to stick with it. They knew their colleagues and they all got along together. But it did make them a bit cliquey, but no more so than main stores, which had around 20 people working there. I just kept my head down and avoided too much conversation. I hated doing overtime there. It was so large and I could never find anything. Then I would have to go and find someone and ask, and they would huff and puff because I didn't know the location of size 10 safety boots simply through osmosis. The main store had everything you needed for a small town other than food. Toilet rolls, soap, safety boots, rubber coats, rubber boots, jackets, tools, pens. But the thing about Sunday is the timekeeping was even worse than in the week. It was okay for those who had been there straight from school. They knew no difference. Drop them in my previous jobs and they couldn't cope. Anyway, what's the time? It must be time for tea break. You're never more than 20 minutes from a tea break when you're working for the MOD. This was a Just the Ticket production.